Right. The conventional starting point for modern Middle Eastern history for many, many years was 1798. That was the year when Napoleon led a French army in an invasion of Egypt. The invasion lasted, or the occupation of Egypt lasted for only 3 years, but the exit of the French was effected very largely by the coming to Egypt of a military force of Albanians led by a commander named Mehmet Ali, or Mehmet Ali, or Muhammad Ali, depending on whether you want a Turkish or a Arabic pronunciation. And he came to be thought of as the founder of modern Egypt. He did not think that the saga of Napoleon was all that edifying, but the example that Napoleon set, not just for Muhammad Ali, but for many other would-be heads of government in the 19th century, was a very powerful one, because Napoleon had managed in the turmoil of the late French Revolution to impose his personal will on virtually every aspect of state and society. In some ways, he was a model of a totalitarian ruler. And his totalitarian rule was based overwhelmingly upon the army that he commanded, which, of course, was defeated in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo, and that was the end of Napoleon. But the example of Napoleon was parallel to, but pointed in quite a different direction from the example of the French Revolution. French Revolution had various ideals, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and thought in terms of the role of the people and different ranks of the people in governing the country and in determining what the norms and rules should be. And Napoleon was in favor of basically a one-man monarchical system. Napoleon was the example that was followed in the Middle East, while the French revolutionary ideals had a greater impact in Europe. And yet there were certainly, throughout the 19th and 20th century, there were people in Europe who really had more of a Napoleonic vision of becoming totalitarian rulers, and of course some of them succeeded. The idea that you can separate the Middle East from Europe in the 19th century and regard Europe as being modern history, and the Middle East and North Africa as being something else that somehow was derivative or unlike Europe, I think is rather a fiction. I think that it really is one history of this world of the Hellenistic heritage. When this subject began to be studied in American academic circles, very largely in the wake of World War II, the idea that Europe with America understood to be part of Europe in this respect as an ideological focus. The idea was that Europe had gone through a really powerfully transformative history, and that history was going to inevitably be repeated everywhere else in the world. And the mission for Western scholars and Western political observers and actors was to observe and anticipate and respond to the Europeanization / modernization of the rest of the world. So when in 1961, Bernard Lewis, the paramount scholar of the modern Middle East in England and America, or in English language, published his book, The Emergence of Modern Turkey, it became kind of a Bible. And it was thought of as being a model of how do you observe and analyze the progress of modernity in a non-European land. And eventually, Lewis wrote a reminiscence saying that in 1950 he had been in Istanbul and there had been a free election in Turkey for the first time, and the ruling party, the party of the late Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, had been defeated in the polls and had peacefully left office. And this was, for Lewis, a vision of the future of the Islamic Middle East. And that vision, of course, it became undermined by reality. But for Lewis, it spawned the question, what went wrong? Which is an eerie sort of question for a historian to ask, because it suggests that there's a certain track that history moves along, and if it diverges from that track, then history has made a mistake. Not the person who has imagined the track, but rather, the people who are living the history have gone astray, because the historian doesn't go astray. Having gone astray so many times in my career, I do not believe any historian ever gets everything right. And certainly the notion of what went wrong with the Middle East became a way of finding fault. What they did in Turkey and what they've done in many countries since that time, 1950, and continuing to today, what that represents is some kind of going astray on the part of the people who live in Muslim societies. That somehow they started in the right direction. They started to become European, they started to become modern, and then they screwed it up. And they're still screwing it up. And the Middle East is this horrible place. That idea is so deeply embedded in the scholarship on the modern Middle East that it is difficult sometimes to see how else you could look at it. As someone who was schooled as a medievalist, and who, if I had remained at Harvard, which was not Harvard's fancy, I probably would have been a medievalist my entire career. But when I came to Columbia, my official duties here meant that I was in charge of Middle Eastern history, both undergraduate and graduate in the history department, from Muhammad to the present. So I had to become a modernist as well as a medievalist, an Ottomanist, etc. But one of the problems I had in doing that was that I really thought that the pre-modern Islamic society was a really cool society. I thought it worked very well. And that what happened in the 19th century was just one powerfully destructive change after another. All of them characterized as reforms, as things getting better. Whereas it struck me that it was just a succession of things that were working being taken apart. In the idea that if it's not broke, don't fix it, would not have applied, because it wasn't particularly broke. But the insistence was not only that it should be fixed, but that it should be replaced. There are several underlying reasons for this. The most obvious one is the colonial mentality of imperialism that took it for granted that the outlook of the imperialists was civilizationally and intellectually superior to the outlook of anyone else in the world. A second notion was a visceral dislike of Islam as a religion, and that to the degree that Islam was part of the society that was going to be reformed, to have reforms that would remove Islam from having any significant role in that society would be good reforms. And part of it had to do with the realpolitik of the time. Who was going to control the Mediterranean, who was going to control the Black Sea, who was going to control the sea lanes to India, who was going to control the Suez Canal, who was going to control this and that, because you had rivalries among European states that were both rivalries on land as to who would control Europe, who would dominate Europe. But because these modernizing states in Europe were all dependent upon imports to a substantial degree, how you controlled the access to and from European lands was almost as important as how you would control a battlefield. So from a deep ideological religious level down to a very practical level of whether the British and the French would allow the Russians to get free or easy access to the Mediterranean Sea for warships, there was a very, very deep European concern with what happened in the Middle East and North Africa. Well, particularly the Middle East, because the French had taken over North Africa. This is rather different from the way the imperial powers worked in other parts of the world, where they would take over a piece of territory and then they would administer it in one way or another. This recognized that Iran, Afghanistan, and the Ottoman Empire were independent lands, and therefore, in order to get them to evolve in ways that Europeans would find congenial, it was important to do it not exactly by indirection, but by some kind of influence that could be wielded over these lands. As it happened, what the Europeans wanted to do dovetailed very closely with what certain governing circles wanted to do and had wanted to do for a very long time. In particular, this meant marginalizing Islam so that the state, which was for all intents and purposes the army, could maximize its role in society. In other words, you had a totalitarian vision on behalf of many European leaders, or many Middle Eastern leaders, Muhammad Ali being one of the first. And the question was, how could that vision be realized? And that vision could be realized through reforms. And those reforms were reforms that would imitate selectively things that were happening in Europe. So Westernization wasn't something that was imposed upon the Middle East unwillingly, but rather something that coincided with the interests of certain strata in Middle Eastern society. Now, how this worked in practice is fairly complicated. If you were living in pretty much any Middle Eastern country or North African country in 1750, you would be part of a rather stagnant economy and living at a fairly low economic level for the most part. But your notion of where you were in society would have been extremely firm, but it would have been complicated because you had several different coexisting patterns of hierarchy that were complicated to look at from the outside, that were second nature for people who were on the inside. And these patterns of hierarchy told everyone who they were and where they were in a social order. So let's say you had let's call it an urban bourgeois type social order. Here you would have cities. The cities would have a citizenry that looked down upon country people. Country people were considered to be outside the orbit of the city. And recent immigrants from the country were always sort of, looked down upon somewhat. Within this, however, you would have wealthy merchants. You would have people of eminence in the religious sphere. You would have guilds that would regulate the economic lives of many working people. You would have quarters. What we would call a neighborhood was much more closely understood with the idea of a city quarter. Studies have been done, very often when you see maps or brief descriptions of pre-modern Middle Eastern cities, they'll say, well, here's the Christian quarter, here's the Jewish quarter, or here's this and that. But the fact of the matter is that those labels are almost always approximate. In other words, you might have a Jewish quarter that no longer has any Jews in it because the label got stuck on it 200 years earlier, and in the course of time, people moved around. There was a time when the Arab quarter of New York City was in the western side of Lower Manhattan, not in Atlantic City or Bay Ridge, because these things move around. So you can't rely on maps. But the descriptions that you get, there's one excellent book I'd recommend called The Middle East on the Eve of Modernity by Abraham Marcus, which is a study of the city of Aleppo in the second third of the 18th century. And he looked at the court records for a period of years. And the court records from the Qadi court, from the religious court, were heavily devoted to property transactions. What you would find now, say, in a county recorder's office or something like that, where you would have deeds that were put on record so that if there was a legal issue, you would have a definition of what property was owned by whom and how and when that property changed ownership. So these thousands and thousands of property transactions all described the property very specifically. And so you could say, well, this is a 3-room dwelling or a 4-room dwelling or a 10-room dwelling, and it has a courtyard or it doesn't have a courtyard, and has a this and that or it doesn't. And so Marcus took these and divided them into value categories. So let's say that a 6-room dwelling is worth more than a 2-room dwelling, and so on. So he made a hierarchy of, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 levels of value. Then he located all of the properties on a map and said, do you have rich quarters and poor quarters? And what he found was that you had some of the highest priced dwellings in every quarter and some of the lowest priced dwellings in every quarter. That unlike what becomes an assumed pattern in Europe and the United States, you did not have a residential division by income in a very stark form. Much less did you have something like the restrictions you find in housing developments, where you must have a 50-foot setback, or every plot must be a 1/4 acre, or you must have this, that, or the other thing. It was, in urban studies terms, much more organic. The cities just grew in this way. And of course, some of the poor people who lived near the rich people were their servants. But the main thing was that you didn't have a very strict division of things. You also found that you had many properties that were owned by multiple people, particularly by women. Because in Islamic law, when a woman inherited property from her father, say, which was required by Islamic religious law, that property was her property. If she married, or if she was already married, it was still her property. Moreover, Islamic law did not require that she spend any of her property on the maintenance of the family. That was the responsibility of the husband. It was, in a sense, a compensation for the fact that the authority over the children, particularly religious authority, lay with the husband. And so beyond a certain age, fathers automatically got custody in the case of divorce. But it also meant that women were inheriting property every single year in substantial amounts because fathers died. So you had lots of women who were going into the market, basically cashing out on their 1/6 ownership of the family home. And so women were far more active in the real estate market, not just selling shares that they inherited, but also sometimes buying up the shares of their siblings, or becoming landlords, buying up other properties. It was one of the ways in which women played a very dynamic role in the economy back in the 18th century. By comparison, under the Code Napoleon, a husband in France controlled all the property of his wife. And that was looked upon as being just the way things were for Europeans. I stress this simply because of the assumption so widely made that everything in Islam is misogynistic, whereas in fact in Islamic law women had a far better situation than they did in European law, both Christian and secular, as in the Code Napoleon. So you had a very complex society in the city, and the rural areas were looked down upon to some degree. The notion of a family farmer living prosperously on his land that you had, say, in the Midwest of the United States, that really didn't exist. The idea of single family freehold farms where you grew crops and marketed them was rare. More often you lived in a village, and the ownership of the village, either outright ownership, particularly in Iran, or ownership of the tax revenues of the village, control of the tax revenues of the village, would fall in the hands of someone who was appointed by the state or had bought the village, and that person might have a summer place in the village, but they probably lived in a city. So you had, from a social point of view, a society that was much more urbanized than, certainly than the United States, but more urbanized than many parts of Europe as well. Now, you also had a religious sphere. In the religious sphere, if you were a Muslim, you emulated the moral life of the Sufis. But you might not be a Sufi or want to be a Sufi. You respected the ulama. You recognized that there was a Muslim court that you took religious disputes to, but also civil disputes. Studies that have been done of the courts at that time in the 18th century have shown that when you had non-Muslims suing Muslims in front of a Muslim judge, that there was no perceivable bias in favor of the Muslim litigant, that the qadis were there to basically uncover the facts of a case, and they uncovered the facts on a pretty even playing field. When there have been studies done of whether government officials being sued by common citizens had a bias in favor of them on the part of the court, the answer to that has been a negative answer. That you had pretty much a status-blind system in place with the Qadi court. These studies, which have been really only the last 30 years or so, have illustrated that the judicial system that you had in the 18th century, even though it was a religious judicial system, was an equitable system, and that people of all religions were inclined to look upon the Qadi court as a fair venue for legal issues that they had. I recall one case that Marcus worked on where you had poor Jews in Aleppo went before the Muslim judge and said, from time immemorial, the rich Jews in our community have paid the poll tax, the jizya, on our behalf as a way of supporting the poor people of the community, and they've quit doing it. And we would like a ruling that would require the rich Jews to pay our tax bill the way they always have. And the Qadi said, this is really something for you Jews to figure out by yourself. This isn't something that is in my purview. So there was no decision. But the fact that you would have non-Muslims suing other non-Muslims in a Muslim court is just indicative of the degree to which the court was considered to be a fairly equitable venue for legal rulings. You had another network that would be tribal. This was spotty from here and there throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Some areas had tribes that were based upon some kind of felt identity. Sometimes these identities were based on myths of kinship, where people would say, I am descended from so-and-so, who's descended from so-and-so, and therefore these other people descended from the same grandfather are my cousin tribes and so forth. This is segmented kinship structure in the terminology of English cultural anthropologists, but you had other types of tribal affinity as well, so that tribes were not as easily defined as they might be, and they usually were to be found in areas of low density of population and difficult physical terrain. So they're deserts and mountains, very largely where you find tribes, and the members of the tribe are often migratory. So within that territory, you don't know where they are. In Morocco, for example, there were large segments of the country, particularly up in the mountains, in the Atlas Mountains, where you had tribes, but the tribes would not pay taxes unless the Sultan went there with his army. Then they would pay the taxes. And so every year, the ruler of Morocco would take his army and he would go on a trip. And he would collect taxes along the way. And people have charted out the routes that were taken every year so that he would spread the burden of his company over various parts of the country. But the whole notion of Morocco was seen as there's one domain that the government collects taxes from regularly and another domain that is free of it, and that's pretty much the tribal domain. Tribes were not totally outside of cities, because the leaders of tribes, whether they were called a sheikh for an Arab tribe or a khan for an Iranian tribe, these leaders would often maintain a home within a city. And they would be in a position to, on the one hand, carry out economic activities and legal activities on behalf of their followers. But it also was a point of contact for the government, who was trying to get members of tribes to serve in the military in case there was some sort of a war. So people knew what tribes they belonged to. Whether, if they had an affiliation, they knew what it was. That might seem rather antique, but I had a Saudi student who met a girl at university in Riyadh and wanted to marry her. And so his fiancés, or his intendeds, mother and all of her female friends flew to Hijaz and spread out through the marketplace to ask about what his family was and whether he was of a proper family. And her mother actually went to the village that he grew up in and went to his house and said, I'm just passing through and it's prayer time. Could I come in and wash for prayers and pray? And so his mother let her in so she could see the inside of the house. And essentially, after this spying operation was carried out, it was decided that since he was a sharif, he'd always claimed to be a sharif, but now they had firmly a notion that he was a sharif, therefore he was of a status in terms of his kin background to marry the woman. And another instance I know of in Saudi Arabia where there was a man who wanted to do business and he was looking to establish a business, and he wanted to be known that he was of such and such a tribe, and found that people didn't believe him. But it was a tribe that was also, in a rather distant way, connected with one of the ruling tribes in the Gulf. So he wrote to the emir who was ruling in the Gulf, said, "Could you come and visit? And I'll, of course, cover your expenses during your stay here, you and your retinue." So the emir came and visited, then everyone knew that he was belonging to the tribe, and therefore he could do business. These things do not disappear entirely, and it's not simply a matter of a place like Saudi Arabia. I know that in talking to Lebanese over the years, I found that when one Lebanese talks to another, if they say, "Well, your name is such and such, so you must be," and then they seem to know the lineage of every family in the country, and whether they can talk to or not. I remember having a friend who was from the town of Marjayoun in southern Lebanon, a Shiite community, though he was from a Greek Orthodox background, converted to Protestantism and become a secular Western nationalist. Now teaches in Cambridge University. He was a graduate student at Harvard. We had a visiting professor coming from AUB who was from Marjayoun, from the same town, and who was also the brother-in-law of Edward Said. And after this visiting scholar, a professor from AUB, had been there for a number of months, and here was this graduate student from the same town, said, "Why don't you ever sit down and have lunch with him?" He said, "Well, my family wouldn't eat with his family." I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, there are old families in Marjayoun, and then there are newcomers." I said, "Well, when these new, and they don't really mix." I said, "Well, when did the newcomers come?" He said, "Well, in the 1400s. And it seems sort of preposterous, but these things continue to have an impact on the affective life of people in the Middle East. And you project it back to the 18th century, they were the life. So you had an urban network, a tribal network, religious network. The Jews had their hierarchy, various brands of Christianity had their hierarchies. The Muslims had their hierarchy, and they all recognized each other's systems. I remember reading in one chronicle in such and such a date, all the people got together to pray for rain, including the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims, because, when it doesn't rain, everyone goes thirsty. And yet there was an assumption for centuries that if someone from your community got to be the boss, he would give favors to people in his community. And if he got to be the ruler, he would give favors to people in his community. So if you had a Muslim ruler, it was assumed that Muslims would get most of the favors. If you had a Jewish ruler, no. Well, you didn't have a Jewish ruler, but you would have a Jewish cabinet minister, or a Jewish treasurer, or a Jewish, and then those jobs would be distributed to co-religionaries. So you had branches of government where you had non-Muslims under a Muslim government that had a kind of monopoly on the activities of that branch. For example, the mint in the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul was not only run by Armenians, but it kept its records in Armenian. And you had, say in Egypt, the bookkeeping done for the people who had land holdings was done overwhelmingly by Coptic Christians. And if your religious group somehow ended up on top, you felt perfectly justified in doing what we would call acting, what we would say, in a discriminatory fashion toward the other people, because they would do that to you. When I look at Israel and see what we call second-class citizenship being meted out to the Palestinians, think, well, that's really Middle Eastern. You know, the Jews are on top, so they, you know, take action to favor their people and disfavor the others, and that has a many-century sort of hallmark to it. Nevertheless, it was understood that everyone with some turn of history might end up on top. And by and large, the groups tolerated each other. There are other possible you know, types of hierarchy you can have in this. All of them were circumscribed by the notion that this was Islamic. All of them in some way would have some kind of point of tangency with Islam. Now, you had another area that in a sense was outside. And that's what I want to stress here. That's the government. The government meant primarily the ruler and his immediate family, or the ruler and his, not just immediate family, and his extended family, a sultan or a shah or a king, what have you. And then underneath that apparatus on top, you would have the army. The army would include the civil administration, because the civil administration was indistinguishable from the military administration. In the Ottoman Empire, the people who were part of the government system were called the askari class. And the people who were in this area were the rayas. Askari means army or military in Arabic. Raya means sheep. And the Askaris did not pay taxes. The rayas did. The idea was that the governed, the rayas, would earn money, and that money would be taken as needed by the military class in order to run the government. The military class had, in most countries, quite marginal connection with these other groups. I've already mentioned how when the Janissaries went into business, they did not become part of the guild system. They were commanded only by their own commanders, and therefore they were free from the guild restrictions. By and large, if you were in the askari class, you simply followed your hierarchy, whether it was a civil or military hierarchy, up to the sultan or the shah, and that was the way you lived. And you did not have much of any dependency on the lower strata of society. I recall an Iranian businessman who was trying to bring order to the financial distress of a Iranian academic organization here at Columbia, and he told the director, well, we will go together to so-and-so, and because you're the arbab, meaning the landowner, you won't talk. I will do all the talking because I'm simply your agent, because you're above talking to people like that. You don't talk to lawyers, you don't talk to bankers. You get someone to do that for you. Of course, what he was trying to do was to keep the director from screwing things up because he had already screwed it up royally. But this idea that you had such a gulf between the group that in Arabic are called the Khas, the elite, as opposed to the Amma, the commoners. That was an Arabic way of thinking of words askari and raya, which are more the Turkish terms. But the gulf between the elite and the rest of society was truly profound. Now you can say the same thing about the European aristocracy, but over a period of centuries, you had a bourgeoisie that arose that, through a series of political confrontations and particularly instances where the bourgeoisie used their influence in the financial field to gain rights and privileges from the aristocracy and from the government, you had a evolution that was that led to a very different political outcome in Europe. This was underway in the Middle East. In other words, you can see in the 18th century that there are some business people and some people who are have connections abroad, who are beginning to open up the rigidity of the system in which the Raya are embedded. But it had not gone anywhere near as far as you had in Europe, particularly after the French Revolution. This society really worked quite well in almost every area except for economic and political power. You didn't have wars, for the most part. On the frontier you might have wars, but not for most people, and since you did not have a draft, when there was a war, most people were uninvolved. And if you were attacked by an enemy because you lived near a frontier, normally if you were part of the common people, you were happy to surrender the city to the other one because wars were between military groups, this ruler and that would-be ruler, and it didn't involve common people. Crime was notoriously low. People even had a hard time when they started to look for records of crime, finding records. So you look at the court proceedings, you simply don't find many crimes. The idea of crime was not well formed. You had certain handful of criminal things or things that had fixed penalties in the Quran. But there were very few. And crime was more or less at the discretion of the government. But it was not very common. It was generally safe for people. Not just because of a poorly developed criminal class, but also because within the quarter of the city, everybody knew everybody else's business. You have, in Islamic law, a right of preemption, so that if someone in your quarter intended to sell his house, the other residents of the quarter had a right to be first buyer, had a preemptive right, because it was felt that who bought the house was the responsibility of everyone in the quarter. And we do have court cases where the people of a quarter will get together and go to the judge and say, you know, there's a prostitute living here. And the judge would order her out because the people in the quarter had a right to have an orderly life. In many cities, the door of the quarter would be locked at night and you didn't get in if the watchman didn't know who you were. Typically, a quarter in a city you'd have a gate, and you'd have a street, and the street might break off here. And be like that, and houses along the sides. But the streets normally did not go through. Once you get into the quarter through the gate, you went out of the quarter through the same gate. Through streets were very uncommon because everyone who was there belonged there. And studies that have been done have shown that in this sort of setup, instead of the street dividing homes, you know, we're on this side of the street, you're on that side of the street, the street becomes the common place of the people in the quarter. And the divisions are along the backs of houses. So that Europeans always felt the streets were dark and crooked and dangerous, but for people in the quarter, living on the street was perfectly normal. And therefore, the idea that you would have a yard where you would have sort of semi-private, private property that was visible in front or behind your house. You did have a courtyard, but if you were outside the courtyard, you were in public space that was fairly safe and familiar to you. The people in the quarter belonged in the quarter. And so crime was very much constrained by this. Each quarter would have a mukhtar or some other official who would be in charge of the affairs, maybe officially by the government, maybe not. When my wife and I went to Istanbul in 1965 and decided that we would share an apartment with another graduate student couple in the quarter of Aksaray, which was a pretty much 100% Turkish-speaking quarter, well, we had to go and introduce ourselves to the deputy of the Mukhtar. Because, you know, we couldn't just move in without everyone knowing who we were. And so he said, well, now you'll need furniture. And so he went with us to the covered bazaar, and we bought furniture at the shops of people he knew. And then he arranged for a porter to carry an entire apartment full of furniture on his back to our apartment. And when we were living with was pregnant and didn't want to use a Turkish toilet because she would fall over. So I used my junior high school drafting skills to design a toilet seat that would be wedged into the toilet cubicle. And so I had the pleasure of taking my design to the local carpenter and explaining to him in my limited Turkish what we wanted. Everyone in the quarter knew that the Ferengis were getting a toilet seat. And when it was ready and was carried back, it was sort of, oh yes, well that's the Americani toilet seat. I mean, it's, it was just a different flavor of life than I was familiar with. More like a small town or village America than something like an American city. This way of life, in the course of the 19th century, was pretty much destroyed. It wasn't destroyed because of creeping economic changes having to do with capitalism and ubiquitous spread of Western businesses, although ultimately that did play a role, was destroyed because the people in the askari class wanted it destroyed. They saw this balance between a set of social and economic and physical structures that gave place and meaning to the life of the bulk of the population as being a limitation upon their ability to assert supreme authority in society. So they took steps which were called reforms, which were heavily praised by Europeans. And these steps, bit by bit, disestablished what had been let's say, a benign and functional society that was fairly peaceful, just not very prosperous. The types of steps that they took were sometimes subtle and sometimes blatant. People who study the history of reform and who study it mostly from the point of view of trying to show how great it was, usually start in 1826. That was a year in which the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Mahmud II, who had been unsuccessful in trying to quell a war of independence in Greece, decided that the Janissary Corps was an impediment to having a good military. So he secretly trained the core of let's say the central elements of a new European-style military, and then at a certain point goaded the Janissaries in the barracks in Istanbul into a revolt and opened fire on the barracks, killed about 4,000 Janissaries, arrested all of the leaders of the Janissaries who were executed in Salonika, and younger Janissaries at lower rank were permitted to go to their home, well, not their home, they didn't really have homes in many cases, but they were not executed. In some of the provincial areas, the Janissaries caught on and managed to stick around despite these moves in Istanbul, but this destruction of Janissaries, called the auspicious event in Turkish, was sort of the beginning of modernization, because Mahmud II now became free from a segment of his military that had become derelict in its military functions, but perhaps even worse, had become merged with the commercial segment of the population through Janissaries moving into business areas. The formal reform movement starts in 1869. It's called the Tanzimat, which means literally a organization. It was patterned on things that were already underway in Egypt under Mehmet Ali. And it was basically an announcement of an intent to change the character of the Ottoman Empire. What Muhammad Ali had been doing in Egypt became something of a model for Mahmud II, his nominal superior in Istanbul, and this largely had to do with what became the hallmark of the entire reform movement, strengthening the army. So that Mehmet Ali had schools created to train army officers. These schools were largely staffed by European officers. They had a school of artillery, a school of military medicine, surgery, a school of music. And he built factories to equip the army. He instituted conscription to force commoners into the army where they had never really served before for 1,000 years. And he built up Egypt to be a significant military force. The rate of conscription, the percentage of men in the army in Egypt, became one of the highest of the time compared with European conscription rates. Bitterly resented by the population. You had the more lurid aspect of it was people who would maim themselves in order to prevent being drafted into the army, like cutting off their thumbs or something like that. So he created whole units of maimed men to show that he would not be dissuaded by that. Sort of like Game of Thrones, I think. And he acted as a tyrant, but he built a strong army. And he built factories, modern factories that would equip the army. And in 1839, he came close to having enough strength to overthrow the Sultan. He was ruling Syria as well as Egypt by that time. And it was only foreign intervention that kept him from taking over, and then the foreigners, the British and the French, forced him to disband a lot of the reforms that he had made. Nevertheless, Mahmud II did the same thing. He created schools, including a music school. I think the brother of Donizetti became professor of military music. The reasoning I never understood the music school business, but there was toward the end of the century, there was a Hungarian Jewish convert to Catholicism named Arminius Famberry, who traveled in disguise throughout the Middle East, pretending that he was a wandering Sufi or dervish. And then he wrote about his memoirs, very famous traveler. And Famberry was in Afghanistan, in Western Afghanistan, which was a point of contention between Russia and Britain as to who would control Afghanistan. And he was standing as a British military detachment when marching past. And someone came up to him and tapped him on the shoulder and said, "The Emir wants to see you." And so he had to go see the Emir. And the Emir said, "You're European pretending to be a wandering dervish, aren't you?" He said, "Dash it, I guess you got me. How did you know?" He said, "You tapped your foot. We don't march in step." But the British had a band with their detachment, and they were playing military music. So the music seems to have been part of the notion of imposing discipline. And this also took the form of everyone wearing uniforms that were uniform, of people having a clear-cut chain of command as opposed to being simply under their own chosen leader. So that discipline in the military became a goal of reform. In the course of the century, more and more and more reforms were instituted to improve the military. So you'd have a war college to train officers in Turkey or in the Ottoman Empire. Then you would have military high schools that were meant to channel the best graduates into the academy. The military academy would eventually become Istanbul University. When you go through the gate now, you can read across the top. It says, the Harbiye, the war college. The idea was that you should have a strong military, and you should have Western discipline, Western instruction, Western armaments, Western equipment, and everyone who is in that track is part of the askari group. That is to say, they're totally dependent upon the ruler for their well-being. Up to maybe 15 years ago, in Egypt, it was commonplace for the government to announce every year how many college graduates they were going to employ. Because if you graduated from Cairo University, the government should employ you. That's what education was for, was to serve the government. Now, they had no need to hire these people. They simply were hiring the new graduates to serve tea to the graduates they had hired the year before, because they had this vastly overstaffed bureaucracy. But the notion of higher education was so strongly associated with government service that it not only seemed like you should hire the graduates, but it meant that you should have total control over instruction, including banning things that you didn't think were in the interest of the government. So the idea that the government totally controls education, it's not bizarre. It goes back to modern education beginning as military education, and the idea that you get an education to serve the state. Law codes. Whole sections of the Sharia were superseded by law codes that were more or less carbon copies of European law codes. So you'd have a commercial law would be brought in from Europe. By the end of the 19th century, the only law of the Sharia that still had force was the law of personal status and family relations, inheritance. Most other aspects of law were superseded. What that meant was you had to train lawyers who understood European law, particularly codified law, because the Code Napoleon was kind of the standard. States would have law codes, and you had to learn the law code. The Islamic law relied a lot on interpretation, and the specialists going back and looking at the case history of applicable to a certain dispute, and now you had law codes coming in their place. If you had modern lawyers, then you also had to have judges who understood the new laws. And the number of jobs for the ulama shrank, because you were replacing the qadis and replacing the muftis. And some of the most eminent religious families who had produced ulama for generations began to think of sending their sons to state institutions. I have a friend whose father was the chief Ayatollah of the city of Shiraz, the 8th generation of Ayatollahs in his family to be religiously in charge of the Shiite community in Shiraz. He was sent to Tehran University, the oldest son, instead of to a madrasa. And once he got to Tehran, he very quickly departed and went to the United States to the University of Kansas. And his father came, found that he had left the country, and flew to Kansas in his green turban and white robes and all to bring his son home, and got there to the University of Kansas. And after visiting for a while, he thought, he can lead a better Muslim life here in Kansas than he can in Tehran with all of its modern perversions. So he not only allowed his son to remain in Kansas, but he sent his second son there so he could, discover what a good religious life is, which is what they have in Kansas. And but then his son, the oldest son, who went on to get an MA in economics somewhere on the West Coast, I can't remember where, ultimately ends up as, after the Iranian Revolution, as the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations. And then when his father dies, he suddenly starts wearing robes and being called Hojat al-Islam, never having gone to a madrasa, never having had a proper religious education, because the family was embedded in the old structures. And this question of families and individuals being embedded in old structures is a very important aspect of things. So that the need for madrasas declined because the new schools did not require ulama, the new law codes did not require ulama. So the madrasas begin to fade, but the old families managed to adapt. The guilds are pretty much wiped out by modern commercial law that supersedes the regulation making of the guilds. A big deal from the middle of the 19th century on was redesigning cities, building straight streets or developing new areas. And European tastes and standards and models were employed. In Nishapur, my old stamping grounds, when you went into the city, when I got there in 1966, you came in on a gravel road that was the highway, and you got to a traffic circle. There was no traffic, but you got to a traffic circle. And you went around the traffic circle, and you went in a wide, must have been 30 meters wide, main street. And in the very center, it crossed another main street. The main street it crossed, when it got to the end of the town, stopped. There was no northward highway, there was no southward highway, but you had a cross street in the middle of the city. And then when you went out, you had another traffic circle. And it looked very modern. But it had also cut through the old bazaar and pretty much killed the bazaar, because the bazaar was based on pedestrian communication. But now you'd be in the southern part of the bazaar, and you'd come, and here was this 30-meter wide street you had to cross to get to the northern part of the bazaar. The whole notion of respecting the old quarters, the old arrangements, disappears, and instead at the crossroads in the middle of the town, the new banks, the new government offices, the modern concerns become the new center of the city. In so many ways, the structures that you had in the 18th century are abolished. And I think sometimes it wasn't even consciously done. But in almost every aspect, the result was to increase the power of the state. It did not increase the power of the bourgeoisie. And indeed, you did briefly had a Chamber of Commerce in the late 19th century in Istanbul, and that was closed down by the government. You had certain charitable organizations, they were closed down by the government because the government wanted to monopolize charity. The properties of the mosques and the schools and so forth were all taken over by the government. So you had a powerful growth of the state while you had a nothing but wreckage and turmoil among the bulk of the population that was trying to adapt to these various changes and seeing a progressive destruction of the social fabric that they were accustomed to. One result of this is increasing disorder. For example, you start to have religious fights by the middle of the 19th century. Christians and Muslims get into battles. That wouldn't have happened. That really didn't happen in the 18th century. You start to have a sort of a radical division into rich and poor. You have a stratification in society that becomes not simply a recognition that there's the Khas and the Amma, but a more detailed stratification that becomes rather oppressive. But when you look at the comparison with Europe, you find very analogous things. The 18th century society of Europe is pretty much taken apart slowly in that same time period. Now, we like to think that this is because we have the Enlightenment and liberal reforms and progressive thinking and democracy and so forth. But of course, there is another side of that, which is the growth of totalitarianism, which comes, of course, to a peak with what you have in World War II. The totalitarian rulers in Europe were defeated by the so-called liberal or free countries. But the totalitarian rulers in the Middle East are still there. To me, it's always been a wonder that liberal European countries, the United States, put so much treasure and life on the line to defeat totalitarianism in Europe, and then totally ignored totalitarianism in the Middle East, with the result that we now have the horrible Middle East that we have today. But this is a story for another day, and that day will be next Tuesday, and I will take up where I left off.